All right. Man, I took a break. I apologize if you were looking for the weekly edition of the Second Look podcast, where we're covering Gospel Fluency by Jeff Vanderstelt. I apologize, I was out. Did a big elder retreat, and then following that, I had a conference to attend down in Orlando. But here we are, back at it, swinging at it, and on chapter 8. And man, this chapter is really good. I mean, super important. It could stand alone like a sermon, or you could copy this and hand it out and be like, hey, believer in Christ, you need this information. You need this information because, man, it's just so important to remember. And it's so common to experience the hardship that comes with our own unbelief, our broken thoughts, and spiritual attacks. There's a lot of people. I mean, this is why we have church, why we do community, why we need to be reminded, because there is an enemy, and the enemy is active in keeping us from experiencing the abundant life that Jesus came for us to have. I mean, that's Jesus's one of his statements of his purpose. You know, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. So why is it that so many people, even in the church, have hardship and discouragement and disappointment and frustration? Why does that show up? Well, in this chapter, which is chapter 8, called The War of the Mind, Jeff calls this spiritual warfare. I mean, he identifies it to say, like, we're in a war. It's a war where the enemy, who is Satan, is working overtime to steal, kill, and destroy our joy in the gospel. That's sort of a mission statement that Jesus pointed out for Satan. I mean, the thief, that's got to be Satan, right? The thief comes to kill, steal, and destroy. But I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. So there's the dichotomy between the life that Jesus offers us and the life that Satan is sort of working to press against us. It's a real war. Paul talked about this in Ephesians 6. He said that we're not really battling against flesh and blood. Our conflict isn't really with each other or with ourselves, but it's against rulers and authorities, cosmic powers over present darkness, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Paul says our battle is a spiritual battle. That's in Ephesians 6:12. And if there is the reality of a spiritual battle, then we need to know how to fight. We need to know how to fight for what's true in the gospel in our own lives, and how to recognize and see where the enemy is working to rob us of those truths, causing us to believe untrue things about ourselves and about others, to make great accusation, to speak words of discouragement or gossip. One of the practices that Paul gave to the church in Corinth in 2 Corinthians 10:5 is to take our thoughts captive and submit those thoughts to Jesus Christ. And I think it's very appropriate to think about, what that really means is that we should think about what we think about, or, think about what we are thinking about, and ask whether or not those thoughts line up with gospel truths. Take every thought captive and submit it to Jesus Christ. That's the idea. What are you thinking about? And is what you're thinking about in alignment with the truths of the gospel? Because if we're honest, we can all fall into the deception. Little side note about deception, just so you're kind of cool with it. Man, we got to be very gracious with one another. Because deception, like, we get tricked. If we knew it was a lie, we wouldn't believe it. Deception works in a very customized way. We fall for the allure of what seems to be true, only to find out that it's not. Just look at Genesis chapter 2, where Satan works to kind of make an appeal that the fruit, it looked like it was good to eat. It seemed like it was a good idea, this idea that we could be like God. And so Adam and Eve are sitting there in this moment falling into a deception. They're believing that, well, maybe this God guy isn't someone to be trusted. I mean, it seems like maybe he might be holding out. They fell into a trap. We look at that from where we are, and we might say to ourselves, I would never act that way. But I think we would. We would act that way because I know we would act that way because we act that way all the time right now, not believing what God says about us or about one another, and choosing by virtue of deception to believe lies about God. To think in our heart, in our experience of our life, that we're unloved, or that there's condemnation, or that there's shame, or that there is a sort of an inadequacy going on that makes us feel less than or unworthy, or that we project all of those thoughts onto other people and sort of live in the bondage of the fear that other people are not expressing themselves the way that they should towards us. They're not being gracious. They're not being kind. That feeling of the haunting of fear and shame and guilt and frustration, they only sort of like work to divide us in our heart and cause us to feel things that are not in alignment with the gospel. Paul is a big guy in this chapter for Jeff, and he should be a big guy in our fight against the war, which is the enemy who's telling us lies. We got to fight for truth. And one of the ways that we can kind of like use as a filter on our own life as we're taking captive these thoughts that we have in our experience of life is to look at the fruits of the Spirit, because they're gospel fruits. So Paul gives a great list. These are things that we want. We want to live in the experience of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. That's Galatians 5, right? Those are called the fruits of the Spirit, but they're fruits of the gospel. This is what happens when we begin to believe the gospel. We believe that we're loved. We start experiencing deep joy. We have authentic peace. We're able to be more patient and kind, which is, the root word there is gracious, towards others, because the gospel gives us those things. But Paul says, in contrast to the Spirit, these are the things that happen when we're in the flesh, when we're believing lies. There's immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, rivalry, dissension, division, envy. I would add gossip and this anti-reconciling spirit, or anti-love, anti-forgiveness. When those things are showing up in our heart and mind, they should be like big red flags that tell us, man, we're not believing something about the gospel, either for ourselves or for others. And even if others are falling short of the glory of God, which they are, we are, I am, right? Even if that's happening and it causes us to feel a little bit disturbed, what we need is the reorientation of the truth of the gospel to bring us back into realities that remind us that we are loved perfectly, that we are guaranteed the promise of the joy that will come in union with Christ, which is ours to embrace. There's peace there in that moment. We can be more patient with others. That's where we want to be, and that's where the gospel takes us. And so really, at the end of the day, what this whole chapter comes down to is about a personal discipline and engagement for fighting for the truth of the gospel, to keep us grounded in the gospel so that we can not fall into traps that would amount to believing lies, falling into deception, living out of our flesh, and being very frustrated, right? Very frustrated and very disappointed. We don't want to do that. Pardon me while I take a sip of my sparkling water. little tickle in my throat there. All right. At the bottom of page 115, that's right in the middle of chapter 8, right towards the end. Sort of the last paragraph. It's the last paragraph on that page. It's got a good closing thought. As we think about this idea of fighting, being at war, and fighting for the truths of the gospel to keep us grounded. He says this: in everything you face, believe. Remember, belief is the work we're to do. We take up the shield of faith. We believe in God. We believe in all that he's accomplished for us in Jesus Christ, and we trust him for every situation. This good news is a helmet that covers our minds to protect us from the lies, accusations, and temptations we face. And we're not just on the defensive in this battle. We can and must wield the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God, and the gospel of Jesus Christ to attack the schemes of the devil. This is all accomplished with an ongoing dependence on the Spirit in prayer. The weapons alone are not enough. We must submit ourselves to the Spirit who empowers them all. This is how we go to war. Now, I don't know about you, but I know that sometimes I don't remember that I'm at war because I look around and I've got, my sparkling water sitting here, and I've got a ceiling fan keeping me cool, and I'm wearing chacos, and it doesn't seem like I'm in the middle of a war. But I'm in the middle of a war, and so are you. And it's a war of belief. It's a war that causes us to stumble because we quit trusting in the offer of the gospel, and we believe a lie that something else is better than Jesus. And that's simply not true. And if we're going to become gospel fluent and help other people become fluent in the gospel, then we're going to have to be engaged in this fight in a little bit more intentional way, and a way that allows us to realize, oh my gosh, man, I really am falling into this trap of believing certain things that are actually not true, to falling into traps that cause me to stumble and to be frustrated with other people. And what I think we need to do is to just commit ourselves to be more disciplined in bringing the gospel into the conversation, bringing the gospel into our own conversation going on into our heart and mind. If you need a little help on how to do this in a practical way, I would highly recommend picking up this small little book. It almost could qualify as a booklet. It's a little bit bigger than a booklet. But it's called The Gospel Primer for Christians, and it's by Milton Vincent. And it's just meditations of the truths of the gospel, and I think they're going to be advantageous tools in this fight against the enemy. I want you to pick that up. Milton Vincent's The Gospel Primer for Christians. All right. Thanks for listening. Can't wait to get into the next chapter. This is a fun journey for me. I hope you're enjoying it as well. And I hope you're learning to grow in gospel fluency.